it's time for me to move away from the game of basketball.
Westbrook stops at the 1 and goes down to a knee.
Bitter labor dispute caused the cancellation of the playoffs.
You don't know when he's going to be back. 2 really serious concussions.
Hello and welcome back to How To Fantasy Sports. In today's video, what we're going to look at is the 2012 fantasy football season, and specifically 10 guidelines that you can use to draft more effectively. As we mentioned in our previous videos, we use a risk management based technique for managing our fantasy teams. What we mean by that is, in this very uncertain world of fantasy play, that we value proven consistency and contribution first and foremost. It is easier to predict a future or forecast a player's production than basing it off a small sample size or one that varies wildly. And when we're talking about consistency, we're not just talking about game to game, but also season to season. So these general guidelines are trying to identify those risky fantasy plays that you want to avoid drafting because they will not return the value of the draft position that you're taking them at. Now, if you can get them a few rounds later, then you may want to consider it. But for now, these players have historically always returned a lower value from their draft position. As always, there are exceptions to these rules, there's no doubt about that, but the majority over time have proven correct. So if you think you know that this is one of those instances that will be, proving the guideline incorrect, great. You can take the chance on these players, but generally, these types of players do not return their value from where they're being drafted currently according to current rankings. So, anyway, that's the qualification. Anyway, here are our top 10 guidelines of players to avoid at their current draft ranking. Number 1, avoid players coming off of record-breaking years. I get the temptation to pick them, and they probably do remain to have a certain amount of value, but at their draft position, they are overranked, expecting the same record-breaking season, which in reality, record-breaking numbers are just hard to duplicate in general. So avoiding record-breaking seasons is a great risk management strategy. Number 2, avoid players coming off of a high TD year. Now, TDs are great and they can make and break your fantasy season, but they're also very difficult to predict and are really a factor of many circumstances, some even just luck, that you can't even account for and predict. Now, if your player returns a high number of TDs every year, then great. That is something that you can expect. But if they pop a big TD number one year, the likelihood of them returning a high number again is very limited. Number 3, avoid adding strength of schedule arguments into your player rankings. There is just no justification for it that early in the season, especially when we don't know specifically who will have a good defense. Not only that, but injuries during the year will dramatically change your team as well as the teams that you play against. So don't worry about it when you're heading into the draft room. Number 4, avoid injury-prone players. These are your Darren McFadden's, your Beanie Wells, your Ryan Matthews. These types of players, there'll be no guarantee that they'll be there for your fantasy team when you need them. Now, they still have value in the fantasy game, but they do not have value at the price that they're being drafted at. They need to be in your RB2 or RB3 before you can begin to consider them. You don't want these in your RB1 carrying your team to fantasy glory only to have it all crumble on their hamstring halfway through the season. Number 5, avoid training camp holdouts that get a new contract. Now, I don't know really why this applies. This is sort of like this Chris Johnson rule, but there is something about the way that these people prepare for the upcoming season, or maybe it's just what happens with the locker room, the teammates, or just even the way the team comes into the season. But for whatever reason, it just doesn't seem to work, and these players do not perform up to the value of their ranking position. So, again, this looks like a Maurice Jones-Drew situation. We should monitor it carefully. If he gets a contract, we should probably bring him down a bit in our rankings. If he doesn't get a contract and has to play, for whatever reason, that will be okay. But anyway, keep that in mind when dealing with these types of players. Number 2, avoid rookies in the top 50 of the overall rankings. Now, again, these are general guidelines, and I understand the arguments against this, but in 2011, there were more rookies that were fantasy useless than were fantasy useful. And the ones that were fantasy useful were drafting outside of the top 50. So, again, I understand the arguments for drafting Trent Richardson. Who knows? Maybe he becomes a good player one day. The fact of the reality is he's an unproven player. So taking on this risk in the first or second round of your draft, when he plays on an offensively challenged team like the Cleveland Browns, is just taking on too much risk at that early stage of your draft. If you can get him later, great. But at that point, way too early. Number 7, avoid sophomores coming off of great rookie seasons. Now, this is for all those Mike Williams fans that are still out there. It is a risk to take on these types of players. Generally, the expectations of them are raised beyond what they've already accomplished, assuming that they will get better in their second year, when the reality, the history is that these players do not statistically improve that greatly off of their rookie campaign. Now, this isn't to say inevitably they won't be great players, and this isn't to say that they don't have fantasy value, but just that their current draft position is considered higher than the value that you will get from them by drafting them at that position. And it is best to get them if you can get them at a later round. Number 8, do not draft the Madden cover. Okay, we're kidding. We don't really believe that appearing on Madden has any statistical bearing in fantasy. But there is obviously a problem in this situation, because generally speaking, the player, after appearing on Madden, has had a statistically worse season. I don't think it has anything to do with Madden and being on his cover, and everything to do with the fact that the previous season was so statistically difficult to duplicate that they don't. So, don't draft according to their inflated value. Wait for them to come down in the rounds or off their projected auction value before investing in them. Number 9, don't draft running backs from teams coached by Belichick, Shanahan, Peyton, I guess it's not coaching this year, and Todd Haley. Listen, these guys don't care about your fantasy team, and they don't base their team game day strategies on the run. Specifically, they use a wide variety of offensive strategies and techniques to win their games, and they're very successful in it. Now, they will probably produce running backs that are statistically valuable by the end of the season in fantasy. However, over the day-to-day, week-to-week management of that team, you cannot count on these running backs being there, and it is best to move on and take another running back who will consistently be able to produce week in and week out. Number 10, don't ever draft a kicker. Ever. Don't even pick one. Just take another player that you can sit on your bench until the day before the season starts, and then figure out which out of all the players you've got is least valuable, drop them, and then pick up your kicker. And there you have it. The top 10 guidelines for risk management drafting in the 2012 fantasy football season. Now, some people will correctly point out that this eliminates so many people from consideration. Well, that is true and not true. It's true that we want you to not draft these people according to their high current rankings. What we want is for these people to come down in their rankings before we start drafting them and taking on the inherent risk that comes with them. Anyway, we hope that you found some information in this video that you can use and help better improve your drafting in 2012. If you have any questions, please send us an email at question@howtofantasysports.com. Otherwise, subscribe to the YouTube channel and pay attention for more videos coming up in the future. Thank you.